Welcome to RankLens. Today, we count down the top 10 countries by military spending. The world spends nearly $2 trillion on militaries every year, and almost all of it traces back to just 10 nations. From quiet Pacific democracies to oil kingdoms guarding sacred ground, from Europe's heaviest hitters to powers that command arsenals capable of ending civilization. We're counting down the 10 countries that spend the most on defense, and the gap between number 10 and number 1 will leave you stunned. These are the top 10 countries by military spending. At number 10, Japan, with $55 billion in annual defense spending. That figure might sound surprising for a country whose own post-war constitution famously renounces war as a sovereign right. Written in the aftermath of World War II, that pacifist clause has shaped Japan's defense identity for nearly 8 decades. Its forces aren't even called an army, they're the self-defense forces. And for generations, Tokyo observed an informal 1% of GDP guideline on military spending, a ceiling that kept Japan's budget remarkably modest given the size of its economy. But Japan doesn't stand alone. Under a long-running security treaty, Tokyo hosts some of the largest U.S. military installations on Earth. American carriers, fighter wings, and Marines operate from Japanese soil, making the alliance one of the most consequential security partnerships in the modern world. At number 9, France, at $65 billion. After Brexit pulled the United Kingdom out of the European Union, France was left with a quietly enormous distinction. It became the bloc's only nuclear-armed state, a fact that reshaped the balance of European defense overnight. Paris guards that status fiercely through what it calls the force de frappe, an independent nuclear deterrent that answers to no one but the French president. Unlike most allies, France refuses to fold its strategic weapons into NATO command. And then there's the crown jewel of the French Navy, the Charles de Gaulle, the only nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in service outside the United States fleet. From the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, that ship projects French power far beyond Europe, a reminder that Paris still insists on playing in the global big leagues. At number 8, Ukraine, also at $65 billion, and the most dramatic story on this list. Just a few years ago, Ukraine's defense budget barely cracked the global top 30. Then, February 2022 happened. The full-scale Russian invasion forced Kyiv to throw everything it had into military spending, and that figure has surged ever since. But Ukraine isn't fighting alone. Its battlefield arsenal is now sustained by an extraordinary pipeline of Allied weapons transfers. American HIMARS, German Leopards, British Storm Shadows, all pouring across the western border. Today, defense consumes a staggering share of Ukraine's national output, far higher than any peacetime country could ever sustain. It is, in every sense, a wartime economy, one where the survival of the state itself depends on how much it can spend and how fast its partners can deliver. At number 7, Saudi Arabia, pouring $80 billion into defense each year. The kingdom is one of the world's largest arms importers, ranking near the top of every global weapons buyer list. American F-15s, British Typhoons, French frigates. Saudi Arabia buys the best money can buy from nearly every major exporter on Earth. And the money? It flows from one source above all. Oil revenues underwrite virtually the entire defense procurement program, allowing Riyadh to fund cutting-edge hardware without the debt other nations carry. But there's another force shaping Saudi security thinking, one rooted not in finance, but in faith. The kingdom is home to Mecca and Medina, Islam's two holiest sites. Protecting those locations and the millions of pilgrims who visit each year is a duty the Saudi state takes as seriously as any border defense, turning military readiness into a religious priority. At number 6, The United Kingdom, at $82 billion. Britain still punches well above its weight on the global stage, and one reason sits in New York. The UK is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a seat held since 1945. That gives Britain veto power over any major UN resolution, a privilege shared by only 4 other nations on Earth. To back that authority with hardware, the Royal Navy now operates 2 Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers, the largest warships ever built for Britain. These floating airfields can deploy F-35 fighters anywhere on the planet. But Britain's most jealously guarded asset is invisible. Somewhere beneath the waves, a Royal Navy ballistic missile submarine is always on patrol, every hour of every day for over 50 unbroken years. That continuous at-sea deterrent is Britain's ultimate insurance policy. At number 5, India, at $86 billion. India fields one of the largest active militaries on Earth, with well over 1 million uniformed personnel standing guard from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. That manpower is sustained by something no rival can match. India is now the most populous country on the planet, giving its armed forces a recruitment base that's effectively bottomless. But India's defense story isn't only about numbers, it's about technology too. New Delhi maintains a credible nuclear weapons arsenal, developed quietly through decades of work and tested openly in 1998. Alongside those warheads, India runs an indigenous missile program, Agni, BrahMos, Privai, building the delivery systems at home rather than buying them abroad. The result is a military designed not just to defend India's borders, but to assert its place as the rising power of the Indo-Pacific. At number 4, Germany, at $88 billion. For decades after the Berlin Wall fell, Germany's defense budget was famously modest, among the lowest in NATO relative to the size of its economy. Post-Cold War budgets long stayed below the alliance's 2% target, sparking years of friction with Washington over fair burden sharing. But Germany's role in European defense was never small. The country anchors NATO's conventional defense across Central Europe, its territory, the staging ground, its forces the spine of any continental ground operation. Now, after years of pressure and a war on Europe's doorstep, the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, is transitioning from its old Cold War footing. New aircraft, new tanks, new strategic thinking. The country that once symbolized European pacifism is rearming for a new era. And that shift is already redrawing the security map of the entire continent. At number 3, Russia, at $149 billion. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia inherited something no other successor state could claim: the entirety of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. Today, Moscow still holds the world's biggest stockpile of strategic warheads, a Cold War-era hoard maintained at staggering expense. But Russian power isn't only nuclear. The country maintains one of the largest tank fleets on Earth, with thousands of vehicles in active service and many thousands more held in long-term storage. Some of those reserves are decades old, but the sheer quantity remains a defining feature of Russian land power. And feeding all of it requires manpower. Conscription remains a core pillar of the armed forces, drawing hundreds of thousands of young men into service each year, a system the modern Kremlin still leans on to fill its uniforms. At number 2, China, at $314 billion. China now fields the world's largest standing military by personnel, with roughly 2 million active troops under arms. But the most striking transformation isn't on land, it's at sea. Beijing has rapidly modernized the People's Liberation Army Navy into the largest naval force on the planet by ship count, surpassing even the United States in raw hull numbers. Destroyers, frigates, submarines, and domestically built carriers are launching at a pace the West has not seen since World War II. None of this happened overnight. Military spending has grown steadily alongside decades of breakneck economic expansion. As China became the world's factory, it converted that industrial muscle into defense capability. And the result is a military that no longer plays catch-up, but increasingly sets the pace across the Indo-Pacific. At number 1, the United States, at $997 billion. That figure is so large, it almost defies comprehension. The American defense budget exceeds the spending of the next several nations on this list, combined, a level of dominance no power has held in generations. And that money buys reach. The United States operates the world's largest network of overseas military bases, hundreds of installations spread across dozens of countries, from Germany to Japan to the Persian Gulf. No other nation comes close. At sea, American power is centered on its carrier fleet. The Pentagon funds 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, each a floating city capable of projecting force anywhere on the planet within days. No rival fields even half that number. The United States doesn't just lead this list. It sits in a category entirely of its own. This ranking is more than a leaderboard. It's a map of global power itself. 9 of the top 10 spenders hold nuclear weapons. Most command permanent seats on the Security Council, anchor major alliances, or sit atop critical energy supplies. The gap between number 1 and number 10 is more than 18-fold, proof that military spending isn't distributed by population or wealth, but by ambition, geography, and history. When we ask who shapes the world order, the answer often starts right here, with the budgets, the carriers, the missiles, and the choices behind them. Military spending isn't only about war. It's about what kind of future each nation believes it must be ready to defend. And that's the top 10 countries by military spending. If you enjoyed this countdown, subscribe to RankLens for more.